Okay, this is take two of the stream. Apologies for anyone who tried a moment ago and couldn't hear anything. Hopefully you can hear now. So we're looking at this map of the Mediterranean turned 90 degrees to the right. And what we're seeing here is that, right, Israel is all the way down here. That's Israel and Lebanon above it, or
That's
to the side of it.
Door.
But then over here we have Alexandria, the cities where Jews expand to in the Egyptian areas. We have Greece over here. We have Sicily and Italy, the Italian coast. And then at the top over here, we have northern Italy. We have Cordoba. So this was the highway of the ancient world. This was the superhighway of the ancient world, was the ability to get on a boat and head out into the Mediterranean. And basically, you leave Israel and you head out, and you were going to head to all of these places. So this is why ancient Phoenicians were able to spread throughout the Mediterranean broadly. This is why there is such a thing as Mediterranean culture. This is why, for instance, today we think of this as the meeting point of three different continents. Or two continents, or depending on how you count this. We've got Europe, we've got Asia, we've got Africa. This was not three continents in the ancient world. This was the Mediterranean region. There is a reason why the cultures are similar throughout this region, no matter what continent you may say that you are on. There is a reason why the skin tones in this region are similar, why the foods are similar in these regions. You will find this throughout the Mediterranean, and it's because this was how you got around. So anyhow, just wanted to check in. Was that as impactful of a map for other people as it was for me? Because I saw this week, and it just, all of a sudden, everything made a lot more sense about these thousands of years of Jewish history. So I just want to pause for a second, get responses, thoughts, anything like that. I can put the map back up for a second, even as we don't have the spotlight. Yeah, John. Right, you get on a boat heading out of Israel from Jaffa, from any of these ports, from Haifa, from wherever, and you head out towards sea, and you're going to hit Alexandria, you're going to hit Sicily, you're going to hit Greece, you're going to hit northern Spain eventually. And it just made a lot more sense how we spread this way. Yeah. Any other thoughts, any other questions, reactions to this before we go back in time and review our story? Yeah, Toby. No clue.
You have to check on.
No clue. Someone Google. I mean, I think it takes about a month by ocean, is what I heard, to head across the entirety of the Mediterranean if you're on sail.
It's a good question leading to the story of us Mediterranean area tour.
Yes, exactly. Harriet's suggesting that we have a story of us Mediterranean cruise. I'm in. Yeah. Google it. You'll find it. 2,500 miles or so. Okay. So we are talking about a Mediterranean world, and we are talking about geography that is determinative when we're talking about the story of the Jews. And really, the other way of framing this is we are talking about a civilization and a set of stories that starts spreading out of the bottom of this vertical map that we have, and spreading out and throughout the Mediterranean after this. So let's back up again. Before we back up and tell too much of the story, I also want to ask for thoughts and responses on last week. I thought that was so interesting, where we had Flora, our own Dr. Casson over at WashU, looking at the origins of the Ashkenazi genome. So maybe I'll give the quick version of my big takeaways, and then again, we'll open it for any questions or thoughts. My biggest takeaways are that the endogamy, the in-marriage that has existed as a normative part of Ashkenazi Jewish life for the last 1,000 years is an exception to Jewish history. That for most of Jewish history, we've had significantly higher outmarriage, significantly higher rates of conversion, and significantly less racialization of Jewish identity. That there is something about the European experience of the last 1,000 years that caused an insularity to Ashkenazi Jewish culture, Ashkenazi Jewish civilization, and Ashkenazi Jewish genetics. So that was one of my biggest takeaways from that. The second big takeaway was this idea that the Ashkenazi genome 1,000 years ago is about half Middle Eastern and about half European. And maybe it's Eastern European, and maybe it's even Turkic, the Khuzari story. Maybe there is more truth to that than we had thought. But that was the Ashkenazi genome of 1,000 years ago, and then that became just this insular thing throughout Europe in the last 1,000 years. Okay, thoughts or other takeaways from last week, or responses to that? No?
I just thought she was so well spoken.
So interesting, right? Yeah. Yep.
Talk to the question.
Yeah, our first special guest of Story of Us, but she had sent me her paper after Shabbat services, and I just devoured it and said, "Oh, you have to come." Yeah. Zoomers, no other responses from last week? Okay. If there anything else, Susan, yeah, please. Yeah, B'nai Roma is its own category. Yeah.
Well, genetically, there must be a slit because the doctor has a list of diseases that they.
So there are specifically Ashkenazi diseases, exactly. So yeah, great question, Susan. And this is another one of these places where I think in 10 years we're going to have a lot better answers than we do right now. I think the work of these people looking at the genome is just multiplying. But my best guess, and this is how we're going to explain it in a few weeks when we get there, is that actually we see huge migrations of Sephardi Jews after Jews are kicked out of the Iberian Peninsula, and that huge numbers of these people absorb into Ashkenazi communities. And so that there is no such thing as Ashkenazi genome that is independent of the Sephardi Jewish populations. Instead, it is that the Ashkenazi genome is the insular community of Jews living in the Christian world who are forced into a ghettoization with other Jews. And so there are waves of other Jews who sort of make their ways into these communities, but you can't separate out the Sephardi genome. And that's the other interesting thing is Sephardim don't look as different genetically from their Arab neighbors as Ashkenazi Jews do. And again, that probably has to do with just how uniquely insular the Ashkenazi experience is for most of the last 800 years, 700 years, 600. It depends how you count. And but waves of Sephardi Jews make their way into these communities and are a part of that genome. Yeah, Toby.
Mhm.
Yeah. So the other part of this conversation, I think, when we're talking about the supposed Ashkenazi genome is the role of conversion. And again, the idea, many of us are familiar with you push a prospective convert away 3 times before you can tell them they can convert. So much of this is modern Ashkenazi responses. And Ashkenazi, again, not necessarily meaning the genome, but Jews existing and surviving in Christendom. If you can be put to death for converting someone, then you can imagine significant rules that get put in place that poo someone's conversion. Only if they're super, super serious or you go. But if you go back, for instance, to the Roman era, to the era of the early Pharisees and the early rabbis, around the year 0, there's the famous story that most of us probably know about someone who says that they are going to convert if 2 different rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, if you can teach me the whole Torah while standing on 1 foot. Right? It's a famous story. Shammai, by the way, goes to hit him with like a stick, a measuring stick, and says, "What chutzpah you have to ask me to do this?" But Hillel, of course, says, "Treat your neighbor. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. Everything else is commentary on this idea. Now go and study."
Mhm.
But what we miss is the beginning of this. Hillel converts him and then tells him this. Conversion is not a year-long process of study. During Hillel and Shammai's time period, very clearly, Hillel converts him almost immediately. Even if you assume that this is a little out of order and he's converting him after telling him, it's all happening at the same moment. This is a lot more like what you find in Islam today. You can go to a mosque and convert that day, and the imam may never see you again. You go, you say the statement of faith 3 times, and it's done. And so at some point, Jewish conversion and joining the tribe probably, we know, was easier and different. And so we have huge influxes of non-Jews who joined the tribe in the Roman era. And it's this Ashkenazi moment where that becomes less common. So that again is explaining, I think, some of the distinctiveness of the Ashkenazi genome and Ashkenazi Jews. John. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Okay. Any other thoughts on last week on Ashkenazi experience? Again, we're going to be talking about the last 1,000 years of Ashkenazi Jewry as we keep moving on too. But okay. There's no such thing as racial purity when it comes to Jews, and there never has been. And the Ashkenazi experience is exceptional in how much the Jewish bloodline is emphasized, mostly by outside pressures. Those are the big takeaways, I think. Okay. Let's go back to our story writ large. We're going to try to do the first 1,000 years very quickly. We've got, half an hour, 37 minutes.
Is there any way that we can make it a little less cool in here or not?
Oh, no, I can't control the temperature. That's way beyond my pay grade. To control the temperature at CRC, that's no. I can, but it's like a 5-minute process, unfortunately. Okay. So the very first people who think of themselves as Jews are probably around 1250 BCE. There's a group of people living in what we would now call the West Bank in those hills who have a story of having been the descendants of enslaved Egyptians who broke free and settled there. We haven't found many pork bones. And so we think that maybe some of the earliest distinctive cultural pieces of this is the lack of eating of pork. That these food boundaries really tell you a lot about who you are and who you are not, and it goes all the way back. Mordechai Kaplan 100 years ago said that the reason you keep kosher is so that you maintain Jewish community. It has nothing to do with God for him. It was maintaining Jewish community. And so sociologically speaking, you can go all the way back. What'd you say?
I said, what a good answer.
Yeah,
People
yeah,
ask
right.
me
Why do you keep kosher, right? Yeah. It's like Elie Wiesel, when asked whether he believed in God, said no, and was asked why he wrapped tefillin every day, and he said, because it's tefillin. Sometimes that's the answer. So at the same time, in the South, in an entirely different group of people who despised those northern settled agricultural folks, we have people who probably have the stories of Abraham and Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah and Jacob and Isaac. And again, I keep doing that in weird orders, but regardless, the ancestors who say that they came from the north. All of this zooming out is a part of this great geopolitics that still has not stopped. The geopolitics of the Northern Empire and the Southern Empire. The geopolitics of what we would consider sort of the broad Middle East and the geopolitics of Northern Africa, Northeastern Africa. Egypt, Assyria. Egypt, Babylon, Egypt, and of course the North changes names more than Egypt does, even as the empires are changing. And Israel, Palestine, whatever we're calling this region, Canaan, is right on the superhighway between these two great powers. So what we see is the destruction of the north by the Assyrians, the northern power in the 750s, sending so many of these northerners fleeing south into Jerusalem, into the desert, and taking their stories of exodus from Egypt with them. 100 years goes by, 200 years go by, and you have more and more people who are intermarrying between these families. And you have kids who are growing up with both sets of stories, matriarchs and patriarchs, and the exodus from Egypt. And it all lives in this world of many, many gods. And it all lives in this world. I'm trying to see if I unplug things, if it'll stop beeping. And it all lives in this world where everyone's religion looks about the same. You will take animals to your local priest, who is someone who's a priest because his dad was a priest, and they will sacrifice this animal in a particularly bloody burning ritual. They will keep a piece of the meat. Part of the meat will be burnt up, and most of it will be returned back to you as barbecue. That's what religion and communing with the deities looked like. And the only distinctiveness is sort of what your particular god's name was, what their iconography was, what the idols looked like, and maybe what they were good at. Baal, the god of the north, is good at rain. Yud-He Vav-He, Yahweh, Adonai, is good at war. Think of Michamocha, it's a war poem, right? So if you're going to war, you want Yud-He Vav-He on your side. If you need rain, you want Baal on your side, or maybe eventually El, and some say that El was also a part of this deity. In fact, we know that all of these existed in this polytheistic universe because Adonai, Yud-He Vav-He, had a bride, Asherah. It was a consort god, and the two of them consorted. Right? This is the world, the mythological world that these folks were living in. So what happens is the Assyrians send them all south, and then pretty soon the Assyrians disappear, or they lose their battle in the empire, and the Babylonians take over the northern empire, and they head south as well. They go to war with Egypt. Now we're in about 586 BCE, and they go to war with Egypt, making their way through Israel. In each of these areas that they make their way through, they're carting off the elites as slaves to their capital city in a brain drain, and they very much do the same with us. And what happens is we make our way there. We make our way to Babylon, and the distinction between were you a northerner or a southerner, are you from the Abraham group or from the Exodus from Egypt group, doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that we're all enslaved, and even more so that the story that once we were slaves, our God remembered us and freed us, becomes incredibly powerful when you are once again living in that experience. And so it's this moment of Babylonian enslavement when the Exodus from Egypt becomes the center of the Jewish story. I think that's fair to say today, wouldn't you, that the Exodus is the central myth of Jewish life? Again, myth as we have come to use it in this group. That is the moment when that becomes true. 586 BCE. So, and it's this experience of living in exile as Jews when the identity of being a Jew comes to exist. An identity, a people, a tribe, a tradition, a religion, whatever words you want to stick onto this. It is during this time period when it becomes something independent from just being a Judean, a member of the tribe of this little area around Jerusalem, right? Judea does not include the coast. Tel Aviv's not in Judea. Haifa is not in Judea. Like huge chunks of what we think of as Israel is not part of Judea. In Jewish identity is born in exile. Similarly, pretty quickly, the Babylonians lose out and the Persians take over this kingdom, continuing to spread, continuing to expand, the Iranians. And the Persians start a theocratic Zoroastrian empire. And what we get in this theocratic Zoroastrian empire is local autonomy. You generally, in some of the regions, get local autonomy, and that's what we get in Yahud, the name for Judea, or the Jewish province of the Persian Empire. And the Persians are big on local autonomy and on a written set of rules. Okay, let's keep unplugging and see if I keep unplugging them. I don't know, Zoomers, are you hearing that beeping that my computer's making every? No? Okay, just in. Everything's unplugged now, so if this doesn't work, I don't know. So I totally lost my train of thought backwards. Oh, the Persians are big on the official version, and so it's the Persians almost certainly who insist that we have an official version of our story. And it's the Persians, in that sense, who sponsor or insist on the writing of the Torah, that there be an official document, an official version of the stories and rules of the province of Yahud. And that's when we get the Torah as we might know it today. You go back in time to 400 BCE, you're going to find a document that's really similar to what we call the 5 books of Moses. So time goes on, and pretty quickly the Persians too begin to lose out, and instead we get Alexander the Great in the 300s, who comes through, who combines really 3 distinct groups. All of a sudden, it is not just the Persian area, it is not just the North African area, but it is also into Greece. And in fact, people who are coming from Greece who are in charge. Again, I think it makes a lot more sense when you look at this map. You can see why people from Greece could control the entirety of this region in a way that doesn't make sense to our geopolitics today.
Can you do a finger point up with your picture to show us?
Of where Greece is?
Yeah.
Yep. It's actually, hold on, I don't even have to move. It's that peninsula over there,
Ah,
right? You've got Italy up here.
yes,
You've got Spain all the way up there, right?
okay.
There's Italy.
France in between.
There's Greece. You see Turkey down there, right?
Mhm.
The idea of Greece being in charge of North Africa seems absurd to our geopolitics of today, because Africa and Europe are like worlds and worlds apart. You look at this map and it all makes sense, right? It just makes sense. Okay. So Alexander the Greek, that too. Alexander the Great combines all of this and is expanding this empire. This is when we get the Maccabees. This is when we get revolts. And consistently, the way we should understand the Maccabees, now we're into the 2nd century BCE, the 160s, 150s, is that the Maccabees are stuck in the geopolitics of the Greek Empire's collapse. Alexander the Great combined these regions. After him, it falls into 3 distinct Greek empires. The Greek Empire of sort of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Persia, everything in the north. The Greek Empire of Northern Africa, Egypt, and the Greek Empire of Greece, into parts of Turkey at times. So these 3 empires, all controlled by elite ethnic Greeks, are at war with each other for power. And so we have, during this time period, Israel going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between the Egyptian Greek Empire and the Syriac Greek Empire. And all of our internal Jewish politics are about that and about that allegiance. And so the Maccabees are really a civil war between Jews who are trying to figure out how to exist in this empire moment. Okay, time keeps going as it does. And pretty soon, the Hasmoneans, the Jews who end up in charge in a relationship with the Greek empires, they become so corrupt, and the Greeks began to collapse enough. And in fact, this northern Greek empire keeps going to war with the Persians enough that eventually Rome comes into the picture. And Rome takes over everything. We're going to go back to this map that we go to over and over again. But this map is the Roman Empire. Right? You add in sort of the north of Europe and into the British Isles, and what you were looking at here is the Roman Empire, which is such a different view of it than I always understood it. The Roman Empire is an empire of the Mediterranean, of controlling this world. Jewish identity becomes a part and a parcel of this. And Jews have spread out throughout this Mediterranean world. We are figuring out how to do Jewish away from the temple in Alexandria. We are figuring out ways that Jewish identity becomes a philosophy like Greek philosophy. We are living in a world where 10 to 15% of the empire are Jews, and 10 to 15% of the empire are non-Jewish believers in the Jewish God. As a mind share, Jewish culture has expanded hugely by the time of the Roman Empire throughout this Mediterranean region. Okay, pausing for questions or thoughts. Okay, Roman occupation gets all of these responses, and we spent so much time on it, we're not going to go into too much detail. But part of the responses are those who reject the occupation as having made Jewish religious observances impure, incorrect, unacceptable. And so the one thing that all of the anti-Roman forces, groups in Israel 2,000 years ago, the one thing they had in common is that rejecting the operations of the temple meant rejecting the legitimacy of Roman occupation and those who would collaborate. And so that's why no matter what else they're doing, whether they are zealots who are assassinating Jewish collaborators with Rome, whether they are Essenes who are going off into the middle of the desert to live an ascetic life and wait for a messianic figure, whether they are part of militarized messianic groups that are trying to organize to rebel against Rome, whether they are Pharisees who are a group who is articulating a way of doing Jewish and being Jewish that exists outside of nationalist politics. The one thing they all have in common is a rejection of Roman collaboration and of the legitimacy of the temple. So when we've rebelled enough and Rome comes in and destroys the temple, it's these groups that are prepared to take over. And the story of the next 1,000 years of Judaism is the story of these fringe groups becoming the mainstream. And to sort of jump to the end of our story, what we see is that 10 to 15% of the empire that were Jews, by the time we get to the year 1000 CE, almost all of them are rabbinic Jews. And by the time you get to the year 1000 CE, all of those non-Jewish followers of the Jewish God have given birth to the rise of Christendom.
By rabbinic Jews, you mean they have no interest in the temple?
So great question. I think since I changed it, you all can't hear probably, but Suzanne asked, by rabbinic Jews, do we mean Jews who have no interest in the temple? So yeah, what we have to remember is after the temple is destroyed in the year 70, and then after the failure of the Jewish rebellions of around the year 100 and the 130s, we stop believing that it is realistically possible to rebuild the temple speedily in our days. That's a specific liturgical reference that I just made. I'm not sure if anyone knows it, but that you'll hear that over and over again in the traditional liturgy. May the temple be rebuilt speedily in our days. And the people who wrote that originally had an actual political expectation that that was possible. It's not that dissimilar from the way that early Christians really expected that Jesus was going to come back very soon. And so much of early Christian theology is built around that notion, a genuine expectation of this happening very quickly. By the way, I wish I could remember who made this comparison, but I saw a comparison that if you want to understand Jewish theology and what you do understand is Christian theology, just replace Jesus with Israel and you get all the big ideas. That Israel disappeared, it went away, it will be coming back, it will bring the end of times, it will be the Messianic era, everything will be perfect when we once again are a free people in our own land. So much of it actually works very nicely. Collective versus individual, all of those things, you can keep mapping it. But let's not go there too much right now and instead zoom back to around the year 200 when we're living in the era after the temple has been destroyed, after it realistically seems possible for it to be rebuilt, and after the movements of the Pharisees have mostly stopped existing. This is one of the real changes to the story of us this time through for me, is this realization that the rabbis and the Pharisees are much less connected, probably, than I had always thought. I'd always thought of the rabbis as simply the continuation of the Pharisees. And instead, what we see is that Phariseeism movement really is destroyed during the moments of Roman destruction. And there's only a fragment of people left from this community. And it is recreated by a group known as the rabbis. That's what the Mishnah is in the year 200. It's the people who think they are the last ones who will ever know these traditions that we're told come from Mount Sinai, desperately trying to write them all down for the future. So that's what they do. They write it down in this document called the Mishnah. And right at this moment, we see really the collapse of Palestinian Jewish civilization. Now, I'm saying Palestinian on purpose because a part of what has happened is that Rome has renamed this area Palestine as a way, again, of trying to tamp down on Jewish nationalisms, de-Judaize the entire area, including its name. It's such a destruction that we see the center of Jewish life progressively moving towards Babylon, towards Iraq. So, okay, let's pause again before we move into the Persians. Now we're through the first 1,400 years of Jewish history. We did that in like 17 minutes, which is not bad for us. Helene. Yeah, great question. So it's a great question. And another way of going backwards through our time is to talk about theology. Early on, even by the time the Torah is written in the year 400 BCE, there's nothing monotheistic about us at all. I mean, maybe the earliest kernels of this idea are beginning to exist, but right, the first commandment is, "You shall have no other gods before me." Nichamocha ba'elim Adonai, who's like you amongst the gods. This is a polytheistic world that we are talking about. Polytheism leads eventually to what we call henotheism or monolatry. They're slightly different, but doesn't really matter, which is my God is the strongest God, even as there are other gods. Right? Sometimes we'll call this playground theology. My God can beat up your God. You then get mono worship, which is still not monotheism, but is the requirement that you can only worship this one deity. We get that in the 620s BCE. And by the time we get into the Maccabean era at the latest, we have things that are like real monotheism, an insistence that there is only one God, that God controls history. You can see maybe precursors of this if you look, for instance, the Book of Lamentations, right? Lamentations is talking about the Babylonian destruction in 586 BCE. And whose fault is the Babylonian destruction? Ours. And our God is punishing us with the Babylonians for our sins. It's not that our God lost to the Babylonians, that their God was more powerful. It's that ours is a God that controls all of history and is operating all of history in a Jewish-centric way, very clearly, but is operating all of history. So that is very close to what we consider real monotheism today, I think. Now, this is still a God who looks like a person. Let's be very clear. This is a God who looks like a person, who exists in a heavenly realm with all sorts of helper deities or angels or whatever you describe that as. But this is monotheism by the time we get to the Roman era. And it is one of the competing worldviews that exists throughout the Roman Empire. There is certainly the gods that we think of as the popular gods of the Roman and Greek Empire, but you also have all of the philosophies that come out of Greece. You have sort of Aristotelian or Platonic notions that approach philosophical monotheism. And this notion of philosophical monotheism becomes the Jewish idea that can exist outside of Judea. Nancy.
So the story of the golden calf. At that time, there wouldn't have been the kind of monotheism.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
I mean, that was
at the
just-
time when the
that
golden
was
calf
later
is
on.
written, it has nothing to do with monotheism at all. No connection at all. No, that's a story of monolatry. That's a story of maybe even mono worship.
Okay.
But the golden calf is not a story of monotheism at all. It probably also is a story of which priests are the correct priests and King Josiah and politics of 620s and things like that. But that's a different layer there. Larry. Yeah, right. So you get things like the magic worker, magician prophets, Elijah, Elisha. Yeah. Interestingly, of course, Elijah and Elisha look a lot like John the Baptist and Jesus and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and right, these sort of magic worker prophets as opposed to the truth teller prophets. Yeah. Okay. Keep on. We ready? We're good? Okay. Oh. Let me give another political frame to these non-Jewish believers in the Jewish deity. Does it make sense how the one thing that all the fringy Jews during the Roman era have in common is that they reject the temple? Right? That makes sense as sort of a unifying identity. Okay. So what happens by the time you get into, let's call it 400 CE, our side of zero, is that you've got a Zoroastrian empire where the Assyrian Babylonian Empire used to be. It is a theocratic Zoroastrian empire. And you get a Christian empire in the West. It is a theocratic Christian empire. Jewish identity, when you live outside of Israel, becomes an option to be not a part of that. If you are rebellious or fringy or not a part of the mainstream or whatever that looks like, you can see why Jewish identity would be appealing. Jumping ahead even further to the year 700, 800 CE, we talked about the Khuzari Empire, this empire perhaps that converted at least the leadership to Judaism. Well, the Khuzaris live right at the geographic intersection between the Romans, or not the Romans, the Byzantine Empire, the Christian Empire, and what had become the Muslim Empire. Jewish identity was a third way, was another option. And so even prior to Christianity, Jewish identity exists as a competing worldview throughout the Mediterranean region and has adherents who, for whatever reasons, often adult circumcision, that has prevented them from joining the Jewish people and Jewish tribe officially. Did that make sense? Okay. So we sort of covered some of the other history we were going to cover there. Let's pause and see any other questions. Any other thoughts? Maybe Toby. Yes, that's a part of it, is what I would say. I would also say that it's less that Jewish identity used to be tribal and became religious, as much as it is that the nature of what it means to belong to this tribal people has changed through time and place, and that the way that Jewish identity works is radically different. Judean identity at the beginning of the story we've told today is about where you live. Jewish identity was about being someone who had come from enslaved Egyptians who came free when it first emerged in Persia in the year 400 BCE. Being a Jew in Roman era 0 was an inherently political identity, because it was the Jews who were constantly rebelling out in the outskirts of the empire. And being a part of that worldview was deeply connected to that. Being a Jew in Alexandria was a competitive worldview as compared to Aristotle, for instance. Being a Jew, well, let's even talk about it today. There are two main manifestations of Jewish identity today. There is a more religiously focused version of Jewish identity that exists in the United States, connected to becoming white in the United States often. And there is a more nationalistic version of Jewish identity that emerged in Israel as a response to creating a European-style nation state there. Both of those are new and divergent ways of Jewish identity operating. But it's not like beforehand there was some perfect idealized form of Jewish identity that existed. That has always been the case. The Jewish identity is fracturing and splintering and taking various manifestations. I would say the one constant has been the notion of us being an extended tribe. What the religiosity looks like changes pretty radically through time and place. I think that's true even just if you pause and look at our moment today. Look at the huge range of things that could be described as religious Judaism. I was thinking of it at this bar mitzvah, where we had an Orthodox rabbi here for Gabi's bar mitzvah, and like how foreign this probably was to her. So that would be my extended answer there, Toby. Yeah. The closest, again, I get to a thesis is that you are a Jew if you tell yourself some version of this story as your own. Okay, any other questions? We didn't quite get up to our goal of getting back to the year 1000, but we got close enough for...
We started along the path.
We started along the path. So next week... starting next week, we will be only online. Story of Us will not be in person starting next week through the rest of the summer. So next week, we will be only online, and we will get back to the Ashkenaz and the Jews of the Ashkenaz, and then, of course, the Jews of the Golden Age of Spain, which is one of my very favorite times to talk about. So we'll see you next week, 5:30, Story of Us, only on Zoom.
Are you going out tonight?